in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
I don't think people should be obsessed with where their fat max is unless they have some indication of like metabolic disease where they don't really have a fat max. Then something could be going on because it's an early indicator of potential insulin resistance and those sort of things.
Welcome to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your endurance potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson. I have a PhD in molecular exercise physiology, and I'm the founder of Critical Oxygen, where my mission is to build better endurance athletes through remote education and in-person physiological testing. Today, I'm joined by Coach Dave Schell, the founder and head coach at Kaizen Endurance, and the head host of the Training Babble podcast, where we regularly do our Fast Physiology episodes. In this Fast Physiology episode, Dave and I talk all about mitochondrial respiration. Well, at least however much we can cover in about a 24-minute period. So if you're interested in learning more about mitochondrial respiration, please reach out to me, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Dave Schell, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. Love to be here.
Oh yeah, always love our conversations, man. So today there's a couple of questions, or I guess there's one burning question, and then we have another episode that we're going to record. But I was recently asked on my Instagram about this sort of thing, and the question is when are your mitochondria stimulated the most? When is mitochondrial respiration the highest? So if those of you listening who have followed my Instagram, you probably know the answer to this already. And I'm hoping that Dave has not seen that post yet. So Dave, that's my question to you, is at what exercise intensity do you think your mitochondrial respiration is stimulated the most?
Man, I'm going to make myself sound really stupid with this, but I would think around VO2 max.
No, that is exactly where it is.
Oh,
so,
all right then.
So this was so there's a common misconception nowadays because of conversations that have been had on other podcasts with other mitochondrial experts, and I'm not going to say names, but you'll probably be able to put two and two together. But basically saying that mitochondrial respiration is stimulated the most at zone 2 or fat max, and that's simply not true. So let me paint a picture for everybody really quick about of physiology. So when we breathe in oxygen, right? And then we get that oxygen to our muscle. Our muscle, more particularly our mitochondria, use that oxygen to resynthesize ATP. That ATP is the energy currency of the cell, and it helps keep contraction going. It helps reestablish membrane potentials. It helps do a lot, like all the functions of the cell that allow us to continue to exercise. So we have some level of oxygen consumption that occurs, and then we breathe out, and we breathe out a lower concentration of oxygen. So what we can do is we can measure oxygen consumption at the mouth when we exercise, and that's called VO2, or rate of oxygen consumption. And if you've ever done a VO2 max test, if you've ever done a ramp test, or I hope I hope the person who did the test with you showed you, VO2 increases linearly with the power output or the exercise intensity that you are required to do. So the amount of oxygen we are consuming continually goes up until we reach a maximal oxygen consumption, or VO2 max. And then it plateaus. Right. Sometimes it doesn't plateau in people, and there's this huge debate, why it doesn't plateau, but it doesn't matter, because I just said oxygen consumption at the mouth is essentially related purely to oxygen consumption at the mitochondria in the muscle during exercise. And when people start to ask or start to talk about mitochondria, then there has to be a maximal rate of mitochondrial respiration that's going on. And if we know that VO2 at the mouth is related to mitochondrial respiration at the muscle, then we know that maximal mitochondrial respiration of the entire body is occurring at VO2 max.
Right.
So that's why I asked you that question, because I had a really good discussion with like somebody on Instagram. He was reaching out, he was asking me this, and it kind of got my gears turning. Is that there's a difference between maximal fat oxidation and maximal mitochondrial respiration. So let me break that down a little bit
Yeah.
now. So we know that now that the mitochondria are using oxygen in the muscle to essentially remake ATP. But what oxygen is used for is to take electrons away from other substrates, and in the process, those electrons are transported down the electron transfer system, and hydrogens are pumped. We pair the pumping of hydrogens with the movement of electrons with ATP resynthesis. So the whole system is revolving around the movement of electrons. Oxygen really, really wants electrons, so we can pass those electrons down. Hydrogens get to be pumped, and then the hydrogens are really what create the mechanical force in order to actually slam an inorganic phosphate and an ADP back together in order to make ATP. And if I implore people to go to YouTube and like look up ATP synthase. It's this crazy. It's a protein that's in your mitochondria, and it looks like a rotor or like a turnstile.
Yeah,
and every time a hydrogen gets let back into the inner mitochondrial, like the matrix of the mitochondria, that rotor spins a little bit.
It's
and
like
the spinning
mechanical,
of that rotor
right?
creates mechanical tension that then basically forces inorganic phosphate and ADP back together. It's freaking incredible. It's so cool. But back to so where we get those electron donors from to give us the electrons for oxygen is from substrates. So from carbohydrates and fat. And the only place, so we're taking slow incremental steps back. So we can get these substrates that can donate electrons at the electron transfer system from fats and from carbohydrates. In order to get those substrates, we have to break down fats and carbohydrates within the TCA cycle or the Krebs cycle within the mitochondria. And carbohydrates start out by being broken down outside of the mitochondria, and then they get to a point where they're either converted to pyruvate or lactate. Lactate goes out of the cell, can be picked up, by another mitochondria, and then brought into the cell to the TCA cycle. But fats, the only way or the only place they can be broken down is within the mitochondria. So this is where the idea of fatmax or maximal fat oxidation, is related to maximal mitochondrial respiration kind of comes into play, because during exercise, we're relying at low intensities primarily on fat. There's still some carbohydrates. And then as exercise gets higher and higher, we will first increase our rate of fat oxidation. And while increasing our rate of carbohydrate oxidation, then there becomes essentially a peak in our fat oxidation. That peak in fat oxidation is thought to be related to the start of the recruitment of from type 1 muscle fibers to type 2 muscle fibers. It's called fatmax. It's also highly related to, first threshold. So ventilatory threshold 1, first accumulation of lactate above baseline, Neer's breakpoint 1, anything that's first threshold. And or zone 2 if you're doing a training intensity. And I hate the fact that there's so many different definitions of this. But essentially what we're trying to get at is this concept of fat max, because fats can only be oxidized in the mitochondria and only used, and then the derivatives of like fat oxidation can only be used in the mitochondria for electron transfer and then ATP resynthesis. So zone 2 is really stimulating maximal mitochondrial fat oxidation, not maximal oxygen respiration. I know it's kind of a little bit of a nitpicky point there, but I think it's important to know that your mitochondria keep getting stimulated until your VO2 max. It's just the substrate that they're using, say at VO2 max, is much different than at zone 2 or fat max. At fat max or zone 2, you're using as much fat as you possibly can, still using some carbohydrates, but as much fat as you possibly can. And then at VO2 max, you're most likely using primarily carbohydrates in order to resynthesize that ATP. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think something that bears mentioning is I think as people learn about these things, so you just tossed a term out there, and I mean, it's been floating around for a while, fatmax, but now it's like, oh, okay, fatmax, maximal fat oxidation. So that's what I need to train. And so I'm only going to train that. And I guess to put it in like common terms, so if we're talking about a 6-zone system for cycling or for power, I think fatmax would occur a little bit above zone 2. So it'd probably be like low zone 3, mid zone 3 for some people. But I feel like this goes back to fasted training. A few years ago, that was the big thing. And so everybody wanted to become more efficient at burning fat. And so doing all their zone 2 rides fasted and stuff like that. And so I guess where I'm getting here is, what is the practical application of that? Like does fatmax matter? Should we be training to try to improve that? Or is it just another observation as we're moving through this intensity spectrum?
Yeah. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think I think overall fatmax is really a consequence of, or not a consequence, but a benefit of a lot of endurance training. But from what I've seen, like the correlations directly between say fatmax and performance, I haven't seen something that has said, oh, the person who can oxidize fats the greatest has the best endurance performance. And if I'm missing something, please send it to me. I know there's a lot of different camps on this sort of stuff, but I think overall, like I've heard 2 different situations, right? Like you can manipulate fatmax by eating more fats within your diet, because when you eat more fats within your diet, that's what your body is supplying to the mitochondria. The mitochondria are going to then adapt to be better at oxidizing fats, and then that will lead to higher rates of fat oxidation. On the flip side of things, the Norwegians, like Olav Alexander Boo and Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden, Olav talks about how high he has gotten these individuals' fat max because they, were training to try to increase that, but they are almost notorious for consuming boatloads of carbohydrates.
Right.
So that's where I think people get maybe a little lost in the weeds of saying like, oh, I need to improve my fat max at all costs. I don't think that's the case. I think, like this is we've talked about zone 2 training before. I think the benefits of zone 2 training is that you can accumulate a lot of volume without accumulating a lot of fatigue. So that's the benefit, is that you're consistently giving your body this stress, and it just so happens that the primary fuel source, as long as you are in a fasted state, because as soon as you start to eat carbohydrates, you're not oxidizing fats as much anymore, is to stimulate fatty acid oxidation. But I think if we took a little bit of a macro lens or zoomed out just a little bit, we would see that actually zone 2 is pretty stimulatory of just mitochondrial density, so the amount of space the mitochondria take up in your muscle at any given time. And then what we have to do is we have to pair that with high intensity exercise, because the high intensity exercise has been shown to increase mitochondrial function, so how much oxygen our mitochondria can actually use, and it pretty much increases the ability to oxidize substrates across the board. And this is high-intensity interval training. So one study that I did during my PhD, we did 7 sessions of high-intensity interval training over the course of 14 days, so every other day. And it was 1 minute on, 1 minute off for 10 reps. So it was 10 minutes of work. It was hard. It was supposed to be at 90% of your max heart rate. But that, we showed that mitochondrial respiration for fats, carbohydrates, and a combination of fats and carbohydrates all increased like 20%. So, but when you do exercise at the lower intensities, you only see increases to fatty acid oxidation. So high intensity interval training is, again, this like sledgehammer for adaptations of mitochondrial adaptation, whereas like the lower zone 2 sort of stuff is much more focused on the ability to oxidize, fats at lower intensities. So long-winded way to say that I don't think people should be obsessed with where their fat max is unless they have some indication of like metabolic disease where they don't really have a fat max. Then something could be going on because it's an early indicator of potential insulin resistance and those sort of things. But overall, I think that if you are following a proper training program where you're doing a moderate amount of volume, some high intensity work that is specific to the race that you're going to be doing and shifts throughout the year, then your mitochondria are going to get pretty darn good at oxidizing fats. And yes, you can maximize it even further by going like, full fat, like high fat diets. But I haven't seen anything that says that individuals, except maybe during ultras and Ironman races, that says that the highest fat max is going to be the best predictor of performance, because I don't think it is, because you still have to be able to use carbohydrates to be able to perform at that high of a level.
Yeah, and I want to say one of the studies that I've seen, I think is by Louise Burke, is with race walkers. Mm-hmm. And even though they increased their transition point or whatever, their performance did not improve. And so it's like if anybody's going to be relying on fat and that low intensity, it would be race walkers, and their performance did not improve.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of those studies, they're a little challenging because what happens with them is that they take people who are naive to the diet and then they switch them over for like 3 or 4 weeks, and then they try to make conclusions when I think you probably need a little bit longer for, the body to actually optimize its ability to, oxidize fats and those sort of things. So that's the counter argument to those sort of studies. I still think they show us that an acute high fat diet is beneficial for increasing fat max, but is not beneficial for performance, like whatsoever. And if you listen to guys like Zach Bitter, who really successful ultra runner, he got pretty famous for being kind of like low carb, high fat. But what he would tell people is that going into his races and anytime he would do high intensity stuff, he was intaking a decent amount of carbohydrates. So it wasn't that he was low carb, high fat all the time. He would switch in and out of it. But that's what he just found like, kind of work for him. And it's because most of his work is probably at a really low intensity. Whereas when he starts to get into the high intensities, then that's where you start to need the carbohydrates. So my argument here is that you need both. I think worrying about increasing your fat max, higher than like as high as you possibly can, I think is kind of a secondary thing. It's kind of like we've talked about VLA max before, where it's like, I could greatly increase my VLA max just by eating a shitload of carbohydrates before doing that test. So it's like, so that's why I'm conflicted. Is I don't know if fat max and say VLA max are really like the outcome variables that we're looking for, because they are related potentially to performance, but they are not. I don't think they are the indicators of performance that some people want them to be.
And so before we end this one, I also want you to touch on something else. So something that I've heard in relation to mitochondrial respiration is that if you're out doing your zone 2 and you do a hard effort, then it disrupts the cell, and it could take up to 30 minutes for the cell to return back to homeostasis. And so you've essentially like ruined your zone 2 day that day.
Yeah, I was literally thinking about this as I was hiking up the hill today and going a little harder than my zone 2. And what I think is probably happening, and again, I don't know, like all the literature behind it, so there's probably some good reasons why this is being said. But when you start to exercise harder, you start to release more stress hormones. These stress hormones can result in vasoconstriction or constriction of the capillaries within your fat tissue. In the fat tissue, your adipose tissue, is where you get the fats from. So by doing these bursts of speed, you could essentially be limiting the amount of fatty acids that can get into your blood, which would then downstream limit the amount of fats that are getting to the mitochondria. On top of that, higher stress levels also inhibit fatty acid oxidation within the mitochondria. So we have to become more reliant on lactate, and carbohydrates, for fuel. I don't think that it's like one of those things where it's like, oh, if you accidentally go too hard, going up a hill, your fatty acid oxidation is fucked for the day. I think another thing we have to remember is that most of the time we're measuring how many or the substrate oxidation from the mouth. And what happens when you start to exercise harder and harder is you get excess CO2 being created because it has to buffer hydrogens.
Right.
So when you have a burst of speed, you're going to result in breaking down more ATP. That ATP breakdown is going to result in more hydrogens that then have to be buffered. So we might be getting a signal that basically says, oh, you're burning way more carbohydrates in this case, when in all actuality, you're just creating more CO2 to try to blow off the hydrogens that were created during that during that high intensity effort.
Yeah.
So again, I don't think. I think at the end of the day, it's like if you just look at your average power over the course of, like a 2-3 hour ride, and if it's pretty close to your first threshold, then you can pretty well say, like, yeah, I was probably burning mostly fats. But then you also have to think about, if you eat carbohydrates, your body wants to burn those carbohydrates because it's just easier to oxidize those than it is fats. So then it's a moot point in terms of arguing, oh, well, you just shut down your fatty acid oxidation. It's like, well, if you're eating anything, then you're going to shut down your fatty acid oxidation anyways, because your body just wants, that's a preferable fuel source.
Yeah.
So I think I came at you pretty hard with the beginning question. And I think a lot of this it's really interesting, but from the perspective of like application, and this is the main takeaway, is that you have to do that high intensity stuff. You have to do that lower intensity stuff almost simply because it allows you to then support more of that high intensity stuff later. And along the way, you have different oxidation rates of your mitochondria and different substrate oxidation rates. And I think it's just all like the substrate oxidation and those sort of things is just a consequence or a reaction of our body to the exercise that's being done, and getting too in the weeds of being like, oh, I can't accelerate up this hill. If I accidentally accelerate up this hill, then it's just going to be, no, it's fine. You're still getting exercise. You're staying consistent. Like you're still going to get most of the adaptations that would come if you stayed at 200 watts versus going up to 300 for a minute or something to climb up the hill.
Yeah. And I think my big takeaway here is, again, getting too into the weeds. I think people get hyper-focused on one aspect of whatever the flavor of the moment is with physiology or whatever. And I especially with bike racing, bike racing is dynamic. You need to be able to produce power in a variety of situations over different durations and all this other stuff. And so while triathlon, and especially like Ironman triathlon and stuff, might be pretty less dynamic, I guess I would say, right?
It's consistent effort, right? That's
yeah. There's not a lot of surges and stuff like that. You're trying to meter out your pace and but you still want to be able to go be dynamic so that if you're in a hilly Ironman, you have the ability to surge up a hill, or in a swim if you're trying to get with a pack or something like that. And so I think variety of the spice of life. And so just you don't want to get one dimensional, and you want to kind of do a little bit of everything over the course of the year.
Yep, 100% agree. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation. You can always find me on Instagram at critical02. Reach out, ask more questions about mitochondrial respiration and those sort of things. I love talking about this stuff, but as you can see, it does get a little complicated. And at the end of the day, it's it matters. In my opinion, physiology matters, because if we understand what's going on at different intensities, then we can start to tweak our training in order to elicit the most amount of adaptations. But I do think that people do have a tendency, like you said, Dave, to go a little bit too far and get a little bit too myopic about, like the one thing that's going to, the one ring to rule them all, as it were.
Yeah.
Because there really isn't. So if you have any questions, you can actually, if you're on Spotify, you can comment now and I can respond to them. So comment down below. If you're on YouTube, comment down below. Reach out to Dave at Kaizen Endurance, or you can check out his podcast, Training Babble. Him and I go back and forth with the Fast Physiology, where, we do a deep dive into, we try to do a deep dive succinctly into some of these topics. Dave, you have anything else to leave them with?
No, I think that's it. I think the big thing is, as you go through these fast physiologies, the one thing we keep coming back to is everything in moderation, and, and mix it up. Don't be too one-dimensional.
Yep, exactly. All right, awesome. Well, we hope you guys enjoyed listening to this episode, and we'll catch you in the next one.